So the first thing I want to talk about is this. In the lecture that I recorded, I left off with the Dred Scott decision. Does anyone have any questions about that? Dred Scott? Does everyone understand what the case was about?
It was basically like nullifying the Missouri Compromise and the Northwest Ordinance.
Okay. Don't use the word nullify, though, because that's what the people do. This is the court. So the court's just overturned.
Invalidated.
Yeah, it's invalidating it, making it unconstitutional. So that was a huge deal, right? People in the North, they really loved the idea that all that Western territory was going to be slaveless. And so when that ruling comes down, the North is just livid. They're really upset about it, and they want to nullify it. Of course, that makes the South mad. Okay, everyone get that? Okay. Now, that brings us to the next kind of big thing I want to talk about is the midterm election of 1858. Okay, that is an election. The only thing that I care about this election is that Abraham Lincoln is going to run for the Illinois Senate. And he's running against, anyone tell me? Stephen Douglas, right? It says it right there on my notes. Now, Stephen Douglas is a really famous guy, right? He is famous from the Kansas-Nebraska Act. You might say he's infamous because of that. But he's a national figure. So Lincoln's going to lose this election, but why is it important that he runs against Stephen Douglas? What do you think that does for Lincoln in the long term?
It like puts him on, it kind of makes him famous in a way.
That's right. Because he's running against Stephen Douglas, the whole country is going to get to know who he is, right? They famously have a series of debates called the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Heard of them?
No.
No.
Okay, some of you
Those are what debate formats are set around.
That's right.
Anyway,
because Lincoln's debating this really famous guy, he becomes famous. The Telegraph is going to actually, people are going to record these debates. That is, they're going to write these debates down. Imagine that these debates go on for like 3 hours at a time, and people will transcribe them, and then they'll send out the debates by telegraph, and those debates will get published in newspapers all over the country. Now, how many of you would read a debate in a newspaper?
I would not.
No one would, right? Nor would I. But remember, like, they didn't have Zoom back then, so what else are you going to do but read debates in the newspaper? So, it's a world that revolves around newspapers, and people are going to read the debates, and they're going to be pretty impressed by Lincoln, so he becomes the national figure. Everyone get that?
Yeah.
Okay. In the debate, here's something that I want to kind of emphasize about Lincoln. One of the prompts that I'm going to have you do for the end of this unit is going to be a prompt on Lincoln's evolving view of slavery. Okay, so I want you to really pay attention here, because Lincoln's going to go from thinking one thing about slavery to something radically different. Okay, so everyone, pay attention, tune in, as Mr. Masson would say. I told you before that when Lincoln was a young man, what did he do that was so cool? He did what on the Mississippi River?
He went down on a raft.
Yeah, he floated down the Mississippi River on a raft, bringing produce down to New Orleans. And on that trip, he saw slavery for the first time. Okay, and Lincoln grows up in obviously a really racist society. I mean, America is a racist society, especially at that point. And Illinois itself has no slaves, but it also has no real love for Black people. But when he sees slaves, men shackled together, he's revolted by it. He's just disgusted by it. So he has just kind of like an emotional response to slavery, and he knows it's wrong. Okay? But that's about as far as he's willing to go, that slavery is wrong. In the debate, he takes exception to Stephen Douglas' Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, remember, what did the Kansas-Nebraska Act allow in that Western territory that had previously been governed by the Missouri Compromise?
Popular sovereignty for free or slave states.
That's right. It allowed popular sovereignty, which meant slaves could come into the territory. And Lincoln, as a Republican, really opposes that, right? Republicans, they want to keep slavery out of the territory. That's why the party has been formed. Okay. So Lincoln is also really upset about the Dred Scott decision because he's afraid that Supreme Court is also going to rule that states can't make slavery illegal either, right? Imagine that. Imagine if, like, all of a sudden the Supreme Court says you can bring slaves to Massachusetts. After a while, the whole country would be a slave country, and he's afraid that, like, the slave aristocracy will control the country. Now, he doesn't really like that at all. So in the debate, we get this thing called the Freeport Doctrine. So pay attention to this. Lincoln asked Douglas, according to the Supreme Court, you can't ban slavery anywhere. But what if the people of a territory didn't want slavery? You're also a proponent of popular sovereignty. So how can popular sovereignty work if the Supreme Court says you can't ban slavery? Does that make sense?
No.
No. Can you say that again?
Yeah. Okay, this is like kind of a complicated thing. So Lincoln's question is this. He says, look, on the one hand, the Dred Scott decision says you can't ban slavery in the territories, right?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
On the other hand, Stephen Douglas says that popular sovereignty will determine whether or not there's slavery in the territories, correct?
Yeah.
Do those two things contradict?
Yeah.
He's
basically calling Douglas a hypocrite.
Well, he's saying that Douglas's popular sovereignty can't work with the Dred Scott decision. And he's asking him, so therefore, what should be done about that? And here's Douglas's response. His response is called the Freeport Doctrine. And Douglas says this. He says, well, if the people of a state or territory don't make any laws protecting slavery, then slavery just won't exist there. It might be constitutional to have slavery there, but if there's no laws protecting a certain kind of property, people won't bring that property to that area. Does that make sense?
Could you repeat that, please?
Yeah. So he says, if Stephen Douglas says this, he says, even though slavery might be constitutional in a territory, if the people of that territory don't make any laws that protect slave property, then no one will bring their slaves there. So there won't be slavery. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It would be as if you know, like you brought your iPhone to my class and I took out a hammer and smashed it, and there was no law against me doing that. Would any of you bring your iPhones to class?
No.
No, because I would destroy them. And the idea is, if you bring a slave to a territory that has no laws protecting slavery, abolitionists will help steal that slave into freedom. Okay. Anyway, that's Freeport Doctrine, and that's kind of an important idea. All right, but I want to move on. Yep. Good.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to move on to point number 2. So remember John Brown? I showed you a picture of him in my last lecture.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, remember he's the guy who. What did he do to those pro-slavery people in Kansas? He hacked them to pieces. Yeah. He comes back east. He's hearing voices from God again, and this time God says, "John, I want you to go and attack the arsenal at Harper's Ferry." How many of you have been to Harper's Ferry?
Me.
You've been there, right? So that was a place where the U.S. government built rifles, weapons, and he goes and he attacks Harper's Ferry. His plan is to steal as many weapons as he can and distribute those weapons to the slaves in the surrounding countryside of Virginia. Okay, and again, he's hearing voices from God to do this. He does it. He attacks Harper's Ferry. Unfortunately, it seems like God never told the slaves what was going on because none of the slaves came out to receive those weapons. Right? So how does his attack on Harper's Ferry go?
Poorly.
It doesn't go well. He gets captured. In fact, he gets captured by a young, not so young, but a colonel in the U.S. Army named Robert E. Lee. And he's going to go be put on trial in Virginia, and he's going to be convicted, and he's going to be sentenced to death by hanging, right? As he goes to the gallows, he says, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood." And he's right? He's basically, the Civil War is going to start. So imagine this from the eyes of a Southerner. If you're a Southerner, now we have John Brown, a white Northerner, who's trying to start a slave rebellion, just like Nat Turner's, just like Toussaint L'Ouverture's. Would that make you really angry if you saw a white Northerner trying to start slave rebellions?
Yes.
It would, right? Now, do all white Northerners want to start slave rebellions?
No.
No. But isn't that kind of what happens oftentimes? We start kind of generalizing that all of these kind of people are the same and they want the same thing. Would you say that we do that in our politics today?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the South now thinks that the North is just filled with people who want to kill them. That's a pretty good reason to go to war. That's in 1857. All right. So that's John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. The next thing, let's talk about the election of 1860. You're all in luck. I used to spend way too much time on this. I'm not going to today. The election of 1860 is kind of strange because there's 4 candidates. Okay. The Democratic Party splits into 2. You get a northern wing that nominates Stephen Douglas. You get a southern wing that nominates John Breckinridge. That's no relationship to the ski resort. You get another party called the Constitutional Union Party, based in Maryland, basically, and that's the nominee is John Bell. And of course, the Republicans nominate Abraham Lincoln.
How are the northern and southern wings different?
Well, they have different nominees.
Oh, but they don't have like different political ideas.
Well, like basically, the Southern Democrats no longer trust Stephen Douglas, right? What does Stephen Douglas do to lose their trust?
The railroad?
Well, no, remember, he
Isn't
basically
it
said
like
the
that?
Lecompton Constitution, Kansas Constitution
Oh, yeah.
cannot exist. He also, the Freeport Doctrine would make Southerners pretty angry as well, don't you think?
Yeah.
Yeah. So who's going to win this election? Abraham Lincoln's going to win. Write this down in your notes. Lincoln wins with only 40% of the popular vote. He's the first minority president. That is the first president to not win a majority of the popular vote. Has that ever happened since?
Yes.
Yeah.
Who was the last minority president?
I thought
Trump.
Trump. And before that?
George Bush II.
Yeah, George W. Bush. And before that, Dylan, you're right, Bill Clinton. Okay, so it happens.
I thought Adams didn't have the popular vote when he beat Jackson.
Oh, you're right. You're right. Yeah, in the election of 1824, he won without the popular vote. So this would be the second time. I stand corrected.
Did Lincoln hold any government position at this time? Because didn't he lose the Senate race?
No, he did not. And he was a real dark horse candidate. There were better known Republicans that people thought should be the nominee, but he was the one they decided on. Most people don't think that Lincoln is going to be a very good president. He just, although he was like a pretty well known in Illinois and a really good lawyer in Illinois, no one really thinks that he's cut out for the presidency. He was born in a log cabin, but he doesn't like he doesn't like people to know that. Anyway, as soon as he's elected, South Carolina has a convention and decides to secede from the Union. Okay, now here's why. Make sure you write this down. South Carolina thinks that Abraham Lincoln is a radical abolitionist. They think that he wants to free all the slaves, that he wants to allow slaves to marry white women, right? That's kind of their obsession. They're something that they worry about. lets freed slaves take white people's jobs. They believe that all about Abraham Lincoln. None of that is true. Okay, what is Lincoln's actual position?
Preserve the Union.
He doesn't like it.
He just doesn't like it.
Yeah, he thinks slavery is bad, and he only wants to prevent it from spreading to the West. He doesn't want to touch slavery at all in the South. He hopes that slavery is just going to die out, and he thinks if it spreads to the West, will it ever die out?
No.
No, so that's all he wants. That's his entire platform about slavery is don't let it spread west. But the South, remember, it's just like today. You know, like depending on your political persuasion today, unfortunately, you believe a certain set of facts that the other party might not believe. Is that true?
Yeah.
Yeah, when there's really only one set of facts, but people are misled all the time. And the South just thinks that Lincoln's this radical abolitionist, and they're wrong. Okay, so South Carolina secedes, and make sure you, this is important. It's followed by 6 other states. So I listed them there on my document. What is AL?
Alabama.
What's the next one?
Mississippi.
Mississippi, Florida,
Georgia,
Louisiana, and Texas. Okay, so those states all secede at the same time. Please note the spelling of secede. I think on the, I don't know, I remember at some point seeing a lot of people misspelling it as succeed. So those 7 states secede. Now imagine this, you're the president-elect, you're not even the president yet, and 7 states have just left the Union. That seems like a pretty hard job, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is
Now,
this during the transition time?
Yeah,
Like,
this is during Buchanan's lame duck period.
So they actually leave? They actually
leave.
become like another union?
Yeah, they're going to start what they call the Confederate States of America. I'll write that down. And we've seen the word Confederate before, right?
Mm-hmm.
When did we have a Confederacy?
The Articles of Confederation.
Articles of Confederation.
Yeah, under the Articles. And what was the problem with the Articles?
They were too vague.
They were too weak, basically. But the South is afraid of a strong federal government because what do they think a strong federal government will do?
Take
away slavery. So they create a confederacy so that states have their rights and there's no strong federal government. Now, the Upper South stays for now, and the Upper South would be Virginia, North Carolina. What's AK?
Oh, Arkansas.
Arkansas, and TN is
Tennessee.
Tennessee, and then also the border states stay. The border states are Maryland, Kentucky, Delaware, and Missouri. All of those states have slaves.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Lincoln's got a bad situation, but it could be worse, right? What would make the situation worse?
If everybody
This is the border state.
Yeah, if the Upper South and the border states leave, right? So that's going to be his goal, is to try to keep as many of those states as possible. Lincoln is said to have said, you know, this is kind of hearsay, but people, someone once said that they heard Lincoln say, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." And we'll talk about that a little bit later, why Kentucky would be really important. But I wanted to show you this map. The gray states are the border states, and the red states are the states that will eventually all secede. But I mean, for one, what would happen to Washington, D.C. if Maryland seceded?
They'd lose DC.
Yeah, D.C. would be gone. Okay, so we might talk about the border states a little bit later. Okay, here's the homework.
Can you move back up to this?
Yeah.
To the states?
Yeah.
Yeah. Am I going too fast?
Mm-hmm.
See, this is why I need Seth. I need to stop and chat with Seth for a while.
Wait, listen, can I go back to like the list of the states?
Yeah, the list.
The list.
Yeah.
It's a nice list.
My handwriting's much better.
Uh-huh.
I mean, yeah. Kind of. Do you have a whiteboard you could use, maybe?
I don't. I was thinking of getting one. I'll show you a picture of my dog. My old dog, Clifford.
Was he red?
He was red. That's Clifford the big red dog.
What up?
Is that the one that crashed the car?
Yeah, the one who stole the car,
Crashed the car. Yeah.
but also solved a crime.
Yeah.
I'll bring Sawyer to class next time.
Oh yay.
Today we had pajama and pet day and advisory. Nobody
that's
brought their
nice.
pajamas with them.
Yeah, no.
We had beach day.
Yeah, we had beach day.
We just
Wow.
had-
I wish I had a junior advisory. The sophomores, they're kind of surly. They don't really like me. Oh, well. Okay, we good?
Yeah.
We got a little break. Okay. So number 5 reminds me of a homework assignment that I put up today, and I think I made it due on Wednesday. Okay. It's one of those assessments on Whipple Hill. You're going to read not the whole of Lincoln's first inaugural address, but there's like an excerpt of it on the assessment, and you're going to answer 10 questions about it. Okay. And I want to talk a little bit about that inaugural address right now. So is everyone ready for that?
Yeah.
So yes, we'll see the assignment on Whipple Hill. And if you pay attention right now, you might even get some of the answers.
Wait.
Okay. First off, how many of you have ever listened to or watched a presidential inaugural address?
Yeah.
Yes.
You've seen them. Okay. Now, generally, most of them, I can think of one that doesn't really do this, but most of them, they're kind of boring. They're kind of like all kind of high-minded, trying to express like the ideals of America, right? Like we're a country that does this. Okay. I mean, I think President Trump's inaugural address didn't really do that so much, but that's a totally different story. But Lincoln, his inaugural address is, I would say, one of the most, it doesn't just kind of like, it's not just, puff. It's, he's trying to make an argument to keep the Union together. And in doing so, he actually kind of like interprets the Constitution in a way that is really important, I think. Okay, so after you do your assignment, we'll talk more about the inaugural address, but I want you to think about a couple of things. When you're the president and you're giving an inaugural, who are you talking to?
The people.
Everyone.
Yeah, you're talking to the whole country. But in this case, Lincoln realizes that he has a couple of different audiences. So I want you to write this down. So he has to talk to the North first, right? This is really important. Write this down. Popular opinion in the North thinks that the South should be allowed to just go its own way. Right? So imagine that. The South secedes, and everyone in the North is saying, like, good, let them go. We don't care. See ya, South. Right? But Lincoln does not agree with popular opinion. He truly, truly believes that A, it's unconstitutional for the South to leave. And if the South can leave, what could any other state do?
Leave.
Leave. And so what happens to having a country if you can do that?
It's not.
There is no country. Lincoln also believes that if the South leaves, what will happen to North America? What will North America start looking more and more like? Europe. And what happens in Europe all the time? War, right? So Lincoln feels like if I let the South go, North America, that whole experiment that we started way back in the early 1600s, where we're going to do this kind of create this new kind of world, is going to be destroyed, right? Lincoln really, really believes in the vision of the founding fathers, and he doesn't think it should be destroyed. Okay, so he's trying to show the North that, like, hey, look, we can't let the South go. If we let the South go, it's going to be bad for all of us. Okay, and then he's got to talk to the South, and I think there's two audiences he's thinking about in the South. One is the planter aristocracy. What do I usually call the planter aristocracy? FFVs, but of course it's the FFGs and the FFMIs, first families of all those states. And he's basically saying to them, like, hey, I never once said I was going to do anything to harm slavery. I did not campaign on that. The Constitution doesn't even give me the authority to harm slavery. You have no reason to leave. Stay. In fact, if you leave, what will happen if your slaves run away and cross the border?
They're not your.
You can't get them back.
Yeah, the fugitive slave law will no longer be in existence, right? So, like, this is stupid. Don't leave, right? We've got a shared history. We have shared resources. Like, what will happen to the Army? What will happen to the Navy? Stay. The Mississippi River runs north-south. What are you going to do about that? You can't change that. So he's telling the South, like, look, this is foolish. You've got no reason to leave. I am not going to do anything to you. Okay? He's also talking to, there's plenty of people in the South who don't want to leave. And he's trying to, like, get them to, like, step up and kind of make themselves heard. Right? So I think he's talking to all those groups. He also says this. He says, I will not attack you. Right? We are going to hold on to any property that we still have in the South. So if we have a fort in the South that's still manned by Union forces, we're going to hold on to that. But I'm not going to send an army down south to attack you. Let's work this out. I want to work this out. Okay? So those are kind of important things he says. However, the very next day, he is confronted with a major problem. Okay. Now, most presidents get what we call a honeymoon period. That is, after they become president, the public kind of gives them the benefit of the doubt. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, like people want to see presidents succeed, right? It's a hard job. It's an important job. If a president does a bad job, what happens to everyone?
Good.
Suffers.
Bad things, right? Like, look, I don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican today. Do you want to see President Bush do a good job dealing with the pandemic?
Mm-hmm.
You do, because if he does a poor job, it's going to be terrible. Yes?
Mr. Mack, I don't think it's Mr. Bush.
Did I say Bush?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm old. Come on.
Maybe like
Who is it? Who is the president today?
12 years ago. Not even 12.
Okay. Those of you who have not sinned may cast the first stone. Okay.
What?
I said those of you who are without sin may cast the first stone.
Did that come from a fortune cookie?
Killen, can you just let them know who said that?
Jesus.
Thank you. I'm quoting.
Jesus?
I'm quoting.
What does have? I'm so confused. What does this have to do with?
Well, I made a minor mistake, and
Wait, Mr.
I was
Mack.
viciously attacked.
It is
And I say to you, those of you who are without sin may cast the first stone.
That happens to me too.
like will attack you if
Yeah.
you're wrong.
Okay, I'm sorry. President Trump. Do we all want to see him succeed in dealing with the pandemic?
Yeah.
We do. Like, because we want the pandemic to not
We want it to be
shut
over.
down society for the next 6
Yeah.
months. Okay, so most presidents get a honeymoon period. Lincoln's honeymoon period lasts 1 day because the day after he's inaugurated, he is confronted with the news that a fort in Charleston Harbor called Fort Sumter is running low on supplies. What did he say in the inaugural address he was going to do to any Union-held forts?
Support them.
He was going to hold them, right, and keep occupying them. But now that he knows that that fort is running out of supplies, what does he have to do?
Resupply.
Restock.
Yes, well, he could do that, but he also said that he wasn't going to attack the South, right?
Wait,
And-
what did he say about?
Hmm?
Like, what is he saying?
Okay,
About-
so in the inaugural address, he said, like, I'm going to hold on to anything that we have still in the South, any fort in the South, I'm going to hold on to. And he also says, I won't attack you, right? But now he's told that the fort is running low on supplies and it needs more men to defend it, right?
Yeah.
And Lincoln feels like, oh, I have got only two options. If I withdraw the troops from the fort, how do I look?
Weak.
I look
That
weak.
you're not following what you said you would do.
Right. I look weak. And if I look weak, what will the upper South and maybe the border states do?
Leave. I'll leave.
They'll leave. They'll be like, this guy's a pushover. Why should we stay? If he sends reinforcements down, how will he look?
Like he's about to fight
He's
you.
planning an attack on the South.
Yeah, he'll look like an aggressor. And what will the upper South and the border states do?
Leave.
They'll leave. So you see, he's between a rock and a hard place.
And this is Fort Sumter.
Yeah, this is Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina.
What did he say? What is the Union? The Unionists.
Okay, so the Union is what we call the North, right? The United States of America will be called the Union during this time period, as opposed to the Confederacy.
Yeah,
Okay.
but you like the Unionists with a question mark.
Oh, Unionists are just like people in the South who don't want to leave the Union.
Wait, so the fort is running out of supplies, and that's
Yeah.
why.
The fort has like a couple days worth of food left, and the soldiers are starving. And they also need more soldiers to defend the fort.
Defend the fort from what? The South?
The South.
Okay.
And this is in South Carolina, right?
This is in the harbor of South Carolina. It's an island in the middle of the harbor.
Yeah.
Okay, so Lincoln's two options are withdraw the troops and look weak, lose the border states in the upper South, or reinforce the troops and look like an aggressor and lose the border states and the upper South. Here's what he does instead. Anyone want to guess?
Nothing.
He sends supply, just food, no weapons, no ammunition, no men, just food. Now, does that seem aggressive?
No.
No.
No, and could the troops stay there indefinitely if they have enough food?
Yeah.
Yeah, so he's just like biding or trying to bide his time. But the South sees that as aggression. South Carolina does, and they bombard the fort. Look at, here's a little picture. Fort Sumter is bombarded on April 12th, 1861. Eventually, the fort surrenders, and this is the start of the Civil War. Okay, now, who looks like the aggressor now?
South
Carolina.
The South Carolina and the South. Now, remember, one of Lincoln's problems was this. What was Northern public opinion about? How did they feel about the South leaving?
Let them
They
leave.
let them
Just like,
go.
let them.
Yeah, they were fine with it. But what does Lincoln think about letting the South leave?
Bad idea.
It's dumb.
Bad idea.
Like,
Now, what happens to public opinion after the South attacks Union forces?
they want the South.
They want a war.
They want war, right? So the South has just kind of played into Lincoln's hands. By attacking Fort Sumter, the North overwhelmingly wants to go to war now. And Lincoln now can fight the war to preserve the Union that he fears he must.
Wait, why did the South attack Fort Sumter?
Because, I mean, they looked at Lincoln's resupply of the fort as aggressive. And remember, how South Carolina and Charleston in particular, are they kind of hot-headed when it comes to things? Did they try to start a war in 1832?
Yes.
Yeah, with the tariff, right?
Rebel.
Now, does the upper South leave?
Right.
They do. After Fort
Wow.
Sumter, the upper South leaves, but what about the border states?
Yeah.
Is the upper South that attacked it, or the lower South?
Well, it's
What is the upper
Charleston.
South?
Okay.
It's South Carolina that attacked the
Virginia,
fort.
North Carolina, Arkansas.
But that means that the upper South, they side with South Carolina and they leave, but the border states do not leave.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Wait, are the border states like neutral?
Well, they're part of the Union right now. Are they neutral? Yeah, Lincoln's going to have to be very careful with the border states because, again, if he loses them, does he lose the war?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the border states are like the key to it all.
Okay.
But wait, the border states, are they like with the South because they have slaves or just?
They have slaves, but they haven't left the Union. They haven't seceded. And Lincoln's
Oh, okay.
desperate to prevent them from seceding. Okay, and did the way he handled Fort Sumter, did that keep the border states in?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so here he is on his second day of the presidency, and he's kind of like pulled off a major victory for himself
Mm-hmm.
by losing this fort, but losing it in a way that makes public opinion turn against the South and keeps the border states happy. Ever see that? Okay, that's all I got today. I went a little longer than I thought I would, but was that helpful? Does everyone feel like you get it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Should I record? Well, this is recorded. Should I post this?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I'll do that. Well, thanks everyone. And I got to run off to my next class, but have a wonderous weekend.
You too.
And I really miss you guys. I would much rather be doing this in person,
Same.
Too.
but it is good to see your faces. All right. Ciao.
Mr. Matt.
Bye.
Yeah.
Later. When Douglas made the Freeport Doctrine,
Yeah.
that was because he realized that the Dred Scott was like just didn't work.
It was his way of saying, even though the court has ruled one way, the people will still have a say in whether there's slavery or not.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Email me with questions, or if you want to meet during my meeting hours, email me and let me know, and I'll be there.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.